one of the most powerful men on earth, holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, choices in the face of war leave an indelible mark on the papacy. While the world debates sainthood for one of the most controversial popes of the modern era, history is forced to consider, did the Catholic Church do enough? Pope Francis is the third sitting pope to visit a Nazi death camp. On July 29, 2016, he makes an historic visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. In this camp alone, the Nazis put more than 1 million people to death.
According to Catholic teaching today, anti-Semitism is a sin. Jewish people are to be respected. They're not to be converted. They have their own relationship with God. But this was a Christian society that somehow was able to view Jews as enough of an other, an outsider, that they could live with this.
Pope Francis's visit to Auschwitz immerses the pontificate in a harrowing time in both world and church history. Faced with the haunting images of the Holocaust, Pope Francis is confronted by the legacies of his predecessors.
The question is not only what we think the Pope did during the Second World War and during the Holocaust, but what we think the Pope should have done.
Pope Pius XII is a polarizing figure. Many praise his bravery in the face of fascism, while others believe he could have done more.
There's a controversial move to canonize Pius XII, to have him declared a saint. I think the real crux of the issue is whether the actions of this Pope in the midst of one of the great tragedies of human history, whether that's the stuff of the Vicar of Christ. Is that the stuff of a saint?
The controversy surrounding Pius XII begins long before he ever becomes Pope. From 1917 to 1929, Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XII, serves as a papal ambassador stationed in Germany.
Pacelli was tapped by the Vatican to try to go to Germany to bring an end to World War I. He didn't bring an end to the war, but he stayed in Germany. He was helping displaced persons, injured persons. Then the soldiers come back.
Because of World War I and Germany losing World War I, Germany was in a state of chaos. And as a result, there was political unrest, there was revolution.
You've got a bunch of young men who don't have jobs, and they feel like they were betrayed by their country, and there's this violence in the streets. They start forming these organizations that eventually morph into the Nazis.
Oppressive government regimes across Europe gain traction by blaming outsiders, immigrants, and Jews for the post-war economic and political crisis. In 1922, Benito Mussolini leads the National Fascist Party to a victory in Italy, while Hitler and the Nazis rise to power in Germany, where Pacelli is stationed. New Pope Pius XI is faced with unprecedented unrest.
Pius XI was an interesting pope. A diplomat, very experienced in international politics, and he saw the evil of Nazism.
The Nazi Party stands firmly as anti-religion, putting Jews and Catholics in their crosshairs. Alarmed by what he sees happening in Nazi Germany, Pius XI implores Pacelli to be his eyes and ears on the ground.
Hitler's in Munich, and the future Pope Pius XII is in Munich at the same time. He sees Hitler seizing power, and he's reporting back to Rome about what's going on.
Pius XI and Eugenio Pacelli had a very unique relationship. Pacelli was really, really critical in helping to steer much of the major decisions that Pius XI made. Pius XI asked Eugenio Pacelli to become his Secretary of State. And so Pacelli becomes effectively the second most powerful man in the government of the church.
As fascism explodes all over Europe, Catholics become enemies of the state.
The thing about Catholics in particular, Catholics had a relationship, a devotion to something outside of government.
There's going to be conflict over the status of Catholic youth groups and whether these youth groups ought to be brought under the umbrella of fascist organizations.
There are some Catholic bishops who were beaten, who had their homes and their offices ransacked.
The church, of course, to be able to operate, has to be physically secure.
The Vatican is faced with an extraordinary dilemma. Because of his experience as a papal diplomat, Pope Pius XI enlists Pacelli's help to negotiate with the fascist Italian government. The result is the Lateran Treaty.
Italy and the Vatican reached an agreement to allow the church to function, allow the Pope to feel secure when he left the Vatican itself.
1929 is really a milestone. The Italian government at this point is a dictatorship in the hands of Benito Mussolini, and the Lateran Treaty returns to the Pope territorial sovereignty, which meant independence.
The Lateran Treaty made Vatican City into an independent nation state.
In exchange for Vatican autonomy, the Pope agrees to halt all opposition to Mussolini's regime. The 1929 agreement sets a precedent. The Church is willing to negotiate with dictators in exchange for sovereignty. In 1929, the Vatican signs the Lateran Treaty, an agreement with Mussolini establishing autonomy for the Church in exchange for political neutrality.
It gave the Church a hold on Italian society.
From the Pope's perspective, it's a major victory, but there's a price to be paid. I mean, Mussolini gets something for having given something. Part of the deal was that the church was to remain outside of politics.
With church opposition out of the way, Mussolini's fascist government flourishes.
The Lateran Treaty, it's a major step in the consolidation of the fascist dictatorship, because one of the things Mussolini is able to do, in fact, is turn to a population that is largely Catholic and show that, in fact, he's made peace with the spiritual leader of the church.
While Mussolini and the Church mutually benefit from their peace in Italy, Adolf Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany, and Nazism becomes the law of the land.
Jews were a target almost immediately. January 30th, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. The first anti-Jewish law is April 1st. And the Nazi movement not only was anti-Semitic, they were anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-Catholic. For Catholics, suddenly they couldn't join their youth group organization without fighting with the local Nazi youth. Their schools would be confiscated. Day-to-day violence was an everyday occurrence from 1933 onward.
After the success of the Lateran Treaty, Pope Pius XI looks again to Eugenio Pacelli to help him defend Catholics in the face of another increasingly troubling dictator. In July 1933, Pacelli negotiates another treaty, this time with the German government, called the Reichskonkordat.
Like the Lateran Treaty, this was a defensive measure. The state says, okay, we will allow the church control over its affairs, but the price to be paid is that the church is not to be involved in politics. It's a controversial agreement. Some see it as sort of a pact with the devil. It effectively takes the Catholic Church out of the political realm at the moment when opposition to an evolving dictatorship was more needed than ever.
It was a fatal stepping back from confronting pure evil.
Although the Reichskonkordat officially prevents the Vatican from working against Hitler, many German Catholics refuse to stay silent.
An anonymous woman in Dusseldorf writes to Pius XI, and she says, I'm walking along in the streets day to day, and children are beating up their Jewish neighbors. How can we be good, moral thinking Catholics with this going on around us?
Despite the tenets of the agreement, Nazis continue to interfere in Catholic life. Nuns and priests continue to be arrested, and Hitler passes sterilization laws, which stand in diametric opposition to Catholic doctrine.
Because, of course, Hitler was not a man you could ever trust. And, of course, you could never do a deal with Hitler.
And yet the Vatican just stays on course. We have a treaty, we have a treaty, we have a treaty.
And so the oppression of the church went on. And it got worse. Infinitely, horribly worse.
As the 1930s wear on, Hitler's dictatorship becomes more and more violent. A litany of anti-Jewish laws are passed, including a boycott of all Jewish businesses. Enemies of the state, including Catholic priests, are put on trains to labor camps.
The concentration camp at Dachau, some have described it as the world's biggest seminary. At one point in time, there were thousands of Catholic priests there.
2,500 Catholic priests died at Dachau. Not Catholics, Catholic priests. At this point, there's no way that the Church and the Third Reich are going to get along.
The Vatican writes more than 50 complaints to Nazis about violations of the Reichskonkordat. But Pius XI does not speak out publicly against Hitler.
In the latter part of the 1930s, Pius XI began to prepare himself and began to prepare the church for some kind of direct confrontation with the fascist regimes.
He distrusted Hitler. He was also opposed to racism. He was personally not very friendly to the Jews. He shared the very widespread Christian belief that the Jews as a people had been responsible for Jesus' death, but he thought that that didn't mean you had a right to invade their human rights, and in fact wrote an encyclical condemning it.
In 1937, Pius XI enlists Pacelli's help yet again. He drafts an encyclical regarding the situation in Germany.
An encyclical is the most formal statement from the Vatican. It's the highest statement a pope can make.
Pope Pius XI calls his 1937 German encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, which means with burning concern. In it, he condemns racism from a theological perspective.
It was talking about how it's foolish to think that God would lock all of what is great in humanity into a single race.
With the Nazis on high alert for any subversive activity, the Vatican uses a secret courier network to smuggle the encyclical into Germany.
It was read from the pulpits in Catholic churches throughout Germany on Palm Sunday.
It was the only time that the whole of Germany heard a denunciation of the regime from pulpits, an extraordinarily brave thing to do.
But the papal risk is a measured one. Although the encyclical denounces racism, it fails to mention Hitler or the Nazi Party by name.
It's a document that bears Pacelli's hand. He is ever mindful of the need and of the desire to try to maintain diplomatic relationship. So it's an interesting sort of doctrinal statement that perhaps lacks some of the political punch that that hour called for.
Regardless of its ambiguous language, Hitler sends Gestapo into every German church to confiscate the document.
Anyone who said it, printed it, repeated it, possessed it, was getting arrested or getting beat up, or their property was being seized. That kind of fear of retaliation. That's what Hitler played upon.
In 1938, Hitler's regime expands into Austria. More anti-Semitic laws are passed. More Jewish homes and businesses are destroyed. And still, the Vatican remains publicly neutral. But on the night of November 9th, 1938, Germany will explode in violence, marking a sinister shift in the Nazi agenda that the world will not be able to ignore. In the 2 years after Pope Pius XI releases his anti-racism encyclical, the Vatican remains publicly silent about Hitler's growing fascist regime. And on the eve of November 9th, 1938, Nazi violence against the Jews reaches a fever pitch.
Kristallnacht was the night of shattered glass. It's the night when the Nazis went to the Jewish businesses, the synagogues, and smashed everything.
30,000 Jewish men were sent to a concentration camp. It was a very public, violent attack on Jews, and after that, it was game over.
Bishops from all over Europe write to the Vatican's Secretary of State, Eugenio Pacelli, demanding a response to the violence in Germany.
The primate of the Catholic Church in England wrote to Pacelli and said, "We need to be clear that this is Nazi terrorism against Jews. Can you make a statement?" And Pacelli writes back saying, well, it's a difficult issue, and what we need to do is just issue a statement of general love and concern and mercy for all in a universal way.
In January 1939, Hitler makes a bone-chilling speech threatening the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And more men, women, and children are sent to concentration camps. Despite the Vatican's neutrality treaties, Pope Pius XI can no longer remain silent.
It's quite clear that when Pius XI was dying, he was about to denounce fascism in quite explicit terms.
Pius XI begins to draft On the Human Race, an encyclical in which he condemns anti-Semitism. But he dies before it is ever released. Now, with Europe on the brink of another war, the cardinals must elect a new pope.
The conclave of 1939 comes, of course, at a critical moment. It's very clear that Nazi foreign policy is becoming increasingly aggressive, and so the election of a new pope garners a great deal of interest, well beyond the Catholic world.
Pius XI had clearly groomed Pacelli to become the next pope.
After a conclave lasting less than 24 hours, Vatican Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli is sworn in as pope. He chooses to call himself Pius XII to honor his mentor.
One of the things that made Pacelli the right choice at this point in time was that all the rival parties believed that he was in their camp. He was, as it were, all things to all men.
He was widely recognized for his diplomatic skill. It was seen that, given that the world was in a state of such tension, that a diplomat pope and one who had considerable experience in international affairs might be in order.
As tensions in Europe continue to rise, Pope Pius XII is faced with a daunting task. He must navigate the role of a religious leader in an increasingly secular world.
I think it compels popes to ask themselves who they represent and for whom should they speak.
Pius XII was trained as a papal diplomat. He deeply internalized the doctrine that papacy functioned best as a neutral force, but can the papacy really be neutral in the face of Nazism?
6 months after his election, the Nazis invade Poland. And World War II is officially declared in Europe.
The Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939 is catastrophic for Catholics. Poland is a Catholic country. Polish Catholics were dealt with very harshly. Priests were often murdered right on the spot. Women were raped. It was brutal, and the Vatican was receiving reports of this and cries for help.
This was a war against religion, against Jews, against Catholics, against anything that was non-German.
Pius XII is forced to re-examine his commitment to quiet diplomacy. With the Church under attack, it is up to the Pope to defend the faithful. Six months after Eugenio Pacelli is elected Pope, the Nazis invade Poland, catapulting Europe into World War II. Despite pressure from Allied forces, including US President Roosevelt, Pius XII's statements remain measured and neutral. Meanwhile, Hitler's agenda only grows in scope and horror.
The Nazis started a program to eliminate people with mental and physical disabilities. That eventually morphed into the final solution.
There was a decision to exterminate every Jewish man, woman, and child anywhere in Europe.
In the 1930s, Nazis had sent Jews, outspoken Catholics, communists, and the handicapped to concentration camps. But in 1940, Hitler opens Auschwitz-Birkenau, the first and most lethal of what will be 8 Nazi death factories. Camps engineered for the systematic mass murder of Jews. By the end of the war, more than 1 million Jews will perish in Auschwitz alone.
News, letters, and cables of exactly what the Nazi regime was doing went to and from the Vatican daily by the hundreds.
Many of his own reliable sources are telling him that the Nazis are engaged in a particularly cruel and unique campaign against Jews. He receives one memo from a military chaplain that begins simply, "The Jews, period, a dreadful situation, period," which dates to 1942.
The Vatican knew precisely what was going on. There was no better informed organization in Europe than the Vatican.
As the horrific images from Germany and Poland spread across the globe, the devout looked to the Pope for guidance. But ever the diplomat, Pius XII worries that action against Hitler might provoke more violence against Catholics.
If Pius XII spoke out, would it make things worse for Polish Catholics? Well, you could actually hardly make things worse for Polish Catholics.
As he himself says, I have to watch what I say because I want to avoid a greater evil. But what he can do, he will do. And a great example of the way Pius XII dealt with this question comes in the Christmas address of 1942.
Questo voto l'umanità lo deve agli innumerevoli morti che giacciono sepolti nei campi di guerra. Il sacrificio della loro vita nel compimento del loro dovere è l'olocausto.
In his Christmas address, broadcast internationally on Vatican radio, Pope Pius XII makes one of his only public statements about the war. In it, he speaks for human rights and against racism. But he fails to mention Hitler, the Nazis, or the Jewish people by name.
He made a very generalized statement about the rights of people that he thought was all he needed to say about the Jewish question.
The bottom line was, even after violence against Jews, the decision in Rome was we're not going to name the Nazis and we're not going to name Jews. We're just going to offer universal love and charity. So it's another opportunity that was missed, and a critical one.
He worried a lot about the consequences of speaking out. One wonders, did he ever really think about the consequences of not speaking out?
Despite Pius XII's public neutrality, Hitler's march towards world domination reaches the Pope's doorstep. In September of 1943, Hitler invades Rome.
It was a situation where the Pope thought that they had an operating agreement, did not think this was going to happen, but about 2,000 Jews were rounded up.
The day of the roundup, the Pope says he doesn't want to have to come out and condemn explicitly Nazi behavior. It's obviously a veiled threat to do precisely that. But he says he doesn't want to do it. So the threat of a public condemnation is dangled, which tells us, in fact, that he and his men understand the power and the value of the Pope's words. And repeatedly, consistently, even as people are being rounded up, he declines to utter that clear word.
As the war rages outside the Vatican walls, Pius XII becomes a target. Rumors fly about a Nazi plan to kidnap the Pope.
Hitler actually got a general and told him to draw up plans to invade the Vatican. Pius XII gathered everyone together and essentially released them if they wanted to leave, but he also submitted a letter that was his resignation that said, if I'm captured, I resign the papacy. So they will not capture the Pope. They will capture Eugenio Pacelli, but not the Pope.
As bombs go off and Jews are rounded up right under the Pope's windows, Pius XII must take stock. His diplomatic efforts have failed, and the Vatican is now directly in Nazi crosshairs. In September 1943, Nazi troops invade Rome. An imminent attack on the Vatican looms, and more than 2,000 Roman Jews are rounded up for deportation to extermination camps. They are held at the Military College of Rome, mere blocks from St. Peter's Basilica. But despite the atrocities unfolding right at his doorstep, Pope Pius XII remains publicly silent.
He takes the path of diplomatic caution in terms of his public pronouncements, but it's not that the Pope was inactive. There is a view that the Pope worked behind the scenes to try to put an end to the roundup. There is some evidence, in fact, that that actually worked.
They got several Jews released primarily because they were married to a Catholic, or they invoked the Concordat to help some of them avoid deportation.
He also then says, well, let's do what we can to alleviate suffering on the ground.
There were some Vatican trucks that would go around and take food and take blankets and try to bring additional supplies to where it was needed.
Some believe that Pope Pius XII's silence is a cover, that throughout the war, he is secretly involved with covert operations with the Allies.
The Pope did secretly tape his conversations. During the week of his election in 1939, the Vatican's tapes show quite clearly that he opted for public acquiescence with the Nazis and at the same time deciding that they must be resisted behind the scenes. Pius XII received information from a Vatican spy in Germany, and he passed this information on to the Western Allies.
Some historians even speculate about papal involvement in a plan to assassinate Hitler.
The key figure in the German resistance to Hitler was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, whom, as it happens, Pacelli had met in the 1920s when he was in Germany. Canaris reached out to his old friend Pacelli and said, "Help me and help Germany get rid of Hitler." Canaris then had access to explosives.
Between 1940 and 1944, there would be 3 failed attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Information about these plots is still shrouded in conspiracy theory, and documented proof of Pius XII's role is almost non-existent.
For a long time, it wasn't known about because the Pope knew if he kept written records, it'd get people killed.
To be really clear, the Pope is not involved in any of the details. He does help to facilitate these contacts, plotting to remove Adolf Hitler. And that's important. It was risky. It was something that he kept from his closest advisors. And it shows us that for all of our understanding of him as very cautious and maybe too cautious, he could at times take some very bold and even risky actions.
Despite the uncertainty surrounding any papal involvement in a plan to kill Hitler, the Church's role in hiding Jews during the war is undeniable.
There's good, reliable evidence that church institutions, religious houses were used to rescue and house Jews.
There is even evidence that Jews were hidden on Vatican-owned properties.
There's some fascinating photographs where you see people not only sleeping on the floors in churches, not only in the hallways, but even on the staircases, up and down the staircases, 3 across.
Close to 6 million European Jews perished during World War II. But nearly 80% of the 12,000 Roman Jews survive.
A large percentage of Jews in Rome survive, in large part because of the actions of many of these religious houses.
The debate around that is, was there a central order to do this? Did Pius XII remain silent during the actual roundup, but secretly issue an order that as many Jews should be hidden as possible? And we've never found an order from Pius XII to shelter and hide Italian Jews. And there were even some cases where he was displeased because it put that particular religious order or religious house at risk.
Despite more than 70 years of retrospect, the pontificate of Pius XII is still veiled in mystery. Who was he, and does he deserve to be called a saint? To be canonized a saint is to be recognized as one who shares an eternal life with God in heaven. In the last 1,000 years, only 7 popes have been made saints. Reigning for nearly 2 decades, many Catholics see Pius XII as a prolific religious leader responsible for shaping the modern church. But as the world debates canonization for the wartime Pope, we are forced to consider the holiness of his actions during one of the most turbulent times in world history.
The heart of the controversy really is whether his diplomatic caution saved lives. Those who advance his cause see that as an argument to make him a saint.
Pius XII is often excused for not having condemned the extermination of the Jews because, as he himself said, had he done so, it wouldn't have done any good and it might have made things worse. But I think it's hard to avoid the feeling that there was some kind of moral failure.
The crux of the debate lies in the character of Pope Pius XII. Who was he, and why did he make the decisions he did?
There are those who see in his reluctance to identify the suffering of Jews in particular. Some see in that the strains of anti-Semitism.
Eugenio Pacelli's time in Germany as a papal diplomat is really critical to his formation, his thinking about Germans and Germany, and one could argue his thinking about Jews. He describes meeting with Jewish officials who he describes as dirty communists with slanted eyes. We can see his negative stereotypes about Jews in his writings, and I'm not convinced they ever really exited his thinking.
The whole of Pius XII's papacy is dominated in our memory by questions. It seems a bit simple to say that there are evil people, good people, because most of us aren't actually one or the other. We're a mixture. It's much more complex.
But the complexities of Pope Pius XII are yet to be unraveled. Questions about what he did and did not do during the Holocaust remain unanswered.
We don't yet have access to all of the wartime archive, so we don't really have a full historical record for Pius XII.
Once they are available and scholars can make a determination of exactly what he did or didn't do, then we can say definitively what the record of Pius XII was. And before we can do that, it would be premature to move forward with sainthood.
Until the records are released, the world can only speculate. Polarized opinions color the emotional debate over the canonization of a deeply controversial historical figure.
If in fact he wanted to protect his own church and his own co-religionists in the face of the Holocaust, that decision had consequences. I think Pius XII was a human being who made mistakes, and maybe he didn't make the right decision in this case. And maybe that's a lesson for this church, that sometimes we don't make the right decision, and we need to atone, and we need to correct ourselves, and we need to do better in the future.
In 2016, as Pope Francis walked through the shadows of Auschwitz, he must face the legacy of his predecessors. He prays for the mistakes he has inherited and for the lessons that will carry the Church forward.
Pope Francis is a radically different kind of pope than the Catholic Church has seen for a long time. He has the rule of love, that's it. Love your neighbor. And if you're doing that, then you're a good Catholic.
Modern popes engage in politics at the highest level, regularly meeting with world leaders and taking meaningful stands against atrocity and injustice. John Paul II works tirelessly to end communism and help the African continent heal in the wake of colonialism and apartheid. Pope Francis continues in that brave legacy, a champion for human rights, unafraid to fight for the freedoms of the oppressed.
Francis and John Paul II have moved us on very significantly. They opened the door. Now the Vatican is actually a player in world politics, particularly in humanitarian aspects, and that's been an enormously important aspect of its ministry. During the Second World War, there was this sense that the Church was very different from the world. The Pope was isolated.
I'm a lifelong practicing Catholic who has worked for 17 years at the Holocaust Museum, and I'm a historian. And so it's difficult to just look clinically at a document where a Ukrainian Catholic shooter is taking a Jewish child by the neck and shooting them while their mother watches, and then going to church the following Sunday to see that Catholics have the capacity to set their faith to one side and be part of the Holocaust that destroyed 6 million families. And to this day, these families come to the museum and you can see that it goes generations deep. It makes one question, what is the point of my faith at all? What is the point of a pope leading a church where love and mercy is not paramount? And it makes you wonder.
In times of tragedy, humanity continues to wrestle with faith. The world looks to the Pope for guidance and comfort. And in the darkest of times, lessons of the past must light his way.